All right, I didn't see anybody else pull up, so we will get started. We are on Zoom, so it's being recorded and it'll be uploaded to our YouTube channel in the next few days, whenever we get around to doing that. So thank you for coming tonight for our program on the CCC in the Catskills. We have Diane Galusha from the town of Middletown, not to be confused with Middletown. She's the president of the Historical Society there, and she used to work for the CWC, and she has a lot of expertise on a lot of things, and the CCC is one of those, and she can really tell us a lot about the local impact of a federal program. So welcome.
Thank you.
And I hope everybody enjoys the program.
Great. First, I just want to say that I am in awe that you folks are starting a historical society, or have started, I guess, a year ago, right? Something like that. Which tells me that history is in a good place in Schoharie County. I mean, what the Gilboa Historical Society has accomplished and continues to do, and Jefferson, they're just over the top with everything they're doing and their new museum. And so those are great examples for us in the Historical Society of the town of Middletown to try to follow, because we all need to be aware of and love our history. Our history needs a little loving. So I'm really happy to be here to share some information that I have. I did write a book on this topic, the Civilian Conservation Corps in the Catskills. But sadly it's out of print, so I can't even, push my book. I can't even do the advertising that I often did at talks that I used to give. But I am still enamored of this topic, and I love the whole decade of the 1930s. So many incredible, compelling things happened in the 30s, and the CCC was really just one of them. Anyway, I'm happy to be here and to see so many familiar faces, historians from Gilboa and from Stanford and from Fleischmann's, all the way from Fleischmann's. So thanks for coming. And so let's just get right into it. I'd like to start this talk by telling you this, giving you this this adage that is attributed to somebody who served in the Civil War. Another day, another dollar. You've always heard that, I'm sure. A million days, I'll be a millionaire. That's the that kind of speaks volumes about what was going on with this program in the 1930s. It was kind of strangely hopeful, but a little bit like, oh yeah, maybe ever I'll be a millionaire. But it's a little bit hopeful, and it's because enrollees in the Civilian Conservation Corps were paid $1 a day. It doesn't seem like much to us, but to them, it was pretty much the world. So the CCC was a federal program born in the depths of the Great Depression that put young men to work in the nation's parks and forests, paying them $30 a month. That's $1 a day, which was, as I said, a princely sum at a time when jobs were really hard to come by and when millionaires were a rare breed indeed. If I can get this to advance. There we go. So the CCC was established in 1933. Former New York Governor Franklin Delano Roosevelt had just taken office as the 32nd President of the United States, defeating in a 1932 landslide Republican Herbert Hoover. Hoover had been blamed by many for failure to pull the country out of the Depression that had been precipitated by the stock market crash of 1929. By the time Roosevelt took office, 12 million people, almost a quarter of the nation's workforce, were out of work. Mortgages had been foreclosed on thousands of homes and farms. Bank failures had swept away savings. Factories had shut down, cutting industrial production to the lowest level ever recorded in this country. Mines had closed, railroads had gone bankrupt. Men who had once been able to support their families were reduced to selling apples on street corners or traveling the countryside looking for odd jobs. The situation was even worse for teenagers and young men who were pretty far down the pecking order. It was estimated that this army of unemployed youth numbered 5 million. Even when they could find work, it was only in part-time or sporadic jobs. Many who quit school at 13, 14, 15 to try to help their families found themselves hitchhiking around the country in search of work. Well, FDR wasted no time in addressing this situation. On March 9, 1933, 5 days after assuming the presidency, he called together the Secretaries of War, Agriculture, and the Interior, the Director of the Budget, and others to discuss an idea to put unemployed young men to work on forestry, flood control, soil erosion, and other natural resource conservation projects. It took only hours for this group and their staffs to draft a bill that would win passage in both the House and Senate less than 3 weeks later. That's kind of warp speed in today's experience. The Emergency Conservation Work Act created what came to be known as the Civilian Conservation Corps. 4 government departments and 26 separate agencies combined forces to get the program off the ground. The Department of Labor set up the system to enroll men aged 18 to 25. The Agriculture and Interior departments developed the work sites and projects. The War Department was given the challenge of organizing the enrollees into companies, feeding, clothing, equipping, and housing them, and supervising their life in specially constructed camps across the country, as well as in Alaska, Hawaii, Puerto Rico, and the Virgin Islands. On April 6th, less than a month after the president called the first meeting to discuss this new initiative, the first recruit was enrolled in Pennsylvania. On April 17, the first camp, Camp Roosevelt, opened in Luray, Virginia. By July 1st, 1933, 1,300 camps were in operation, manned by 275,000 enrollees. So the nation is recognizing the 90th anniversary of the start of the Civilian Conservation Corps this year. Over the next 9 years, before an improving economy and World War II eliminated the need for the CCC, 3.5 million young men would serve at 4,300 CCC camps. They became known as Roosevelt's Forest Army. So 3 of those camps were located in the Catskills: Boyceville in Ulster County, Tannersville in Greene County, and Margaretville in Delaware County. Several others were located in the on the Catskills periphery, in Davenport, Masonville, and McClure, Delaware County, in Lawrence, Otsego County, and in Narrowsburg, Sullivan County. Breakabeen, Livingstonville, and Gallupville hosted camps in Schoharie County. Here you can see a map of the Catskills region with the location of all 11 camps. In Schoharie County, Breakabeen Camp S93 was largely a forestry camp whose enrollees planted more than 8 million trees in Schoharie, Greene, and Delaware counties. In Gallupville, Camp SCS5 was run in cooperation with the Soil Conservation Service, whose workers did erosion control and drainage projects and erected a lime kiln to produce soil amendment for local farms in Livingstonville, in Livingstonville, Camp S119 was one of 26 camps in New York State intended for veterans. It operated from October of 1935 through June of 1941 and helped develop North Lake State Campground in Greene County. So before we look at the work these camps did, let me tell you how the system functioned. Companies of about 200 men were often moved from camp to camp around the country, and their makeup changed as enrollees came and went. Men would sign up for 6-month stints, and they could re-up for a total of 18 months, but after that, they would have to get out of the CCC for 6 months before they were eligible to rejoin. Some found jobs on the outside and were honorably discharged. Others went over the hill, going AWOL and receiving a dishonorable discharge. So some men spent weeks, others years with the CCC. They were paid, as I mentioned, $30 a month, $25 of which had to go home to their families to help them through the desperate Depression days. Enrollees could keep $5, which they spent on toiletries or recreation or whatever they wished. They were given personal hygiene items, work clothes, uniforms, which they had to wear to meals and off-duty activity, shoes and boots, coats, rain gear, underwear, and 3 square meals a day. Not insignificant. They worked 8 hours a day, 5 days a week, and could get passes on weekends to enjoy the local nightlife or go home to visit their families. I love this picture of these 2 boys here who look like 12 years old to me. I mean, they're so many, just kind of, I mean, I don't know how old they really were, but many kids would lie about their ages, and the officials who were signing them up would just, knew that the need was real and just passed them along and let them join. So the camps were run by regular and reserve Army officers in military fashion with a certain spit and polish discipline. Work projects were planned by state conservation department agents who maintained quarters at the camps and organized the work crews. Camps were little villages, usually with 5 40-man barracks buildings, a mess hall, tool house, a garage for a dozen or so trucks and tractors, water and sewage facilities, streets and sidewalks, a recreation hall, a camp store, and usually an education building where enrollees could take classes in everything from photography to plumbing to prepare them for life after the CCC. Many camps put out their own mimeographed newsletters. These were really well thought out little communities, really, whose task was to do these outdoor conservation related jobs, but they thought of everything. They had to keep them busy, they had to keep them active. 200 men who 17, 18, 19 years old could probably get in a world of hurt if they didn't have stuff to do. And the fact that they were teaching people skills and occupations that they could then parlay into paychecks once they got out, I think was pretty forward thinking. So barracks life was an exercise in communal living and getting along, and sleeping under somebody else's laundry hanging there. They were heated by little wood stoves, so I'm sure the farther you were from the wood stove, the colder your nights were. There were camps for juniors, men aged 18 to 25. Breakabine and Gallopville were junior camps. There were camps for veterans of any previous war, no matter their age or marital status. The Livingstonville camp was one of these. There were segregated camps for Blacks and camps for Native Americans on or near reservations. So local experienced men, in LEMs in the parlance of the CCC, were loggers, carpenters, blacksmiths, tractor drivers, mechanics, and others who were employed from the other adults who were employed from the local area to maintain equipment and train the green recruits on tree cutting and planting, tool use, and safety. Putting these men to work also relieved local unemployment. Local doctors and clergymen were also engaged to provide medical exams and to conduct worship services. So now let me tell you about CCC Company 222, which was to occupy Camp 93 in Breakabeen from 1934 to 1941. This is not Fulton, this is not the Breakabeen camp. The company was organized at Fort Slocum, New Jersey on April 15, 1933, just a week after the first CCC recruit in the nation signed up. In June, the company traveled to Potlatch, Idaho. They were there only for a few months before the company was transferred to Chicopee Falls, Massachusetts. And I have to say, I still, in all the years I've been looking into the CCC and talking about it and writing about it, I honestly don't know why they moved people around like that. I mean, it just seems inefficient to me to send a company of 200 men to the woods of Idaho, and then a few months later decide you're going to close that camp because maybe it's too cold or something, and then they move them back to Massachusetts, all the way across the country. I don't know what the mindset was, but camps, just like the men came and went, the camps often came and went. They would establish a camp, as I'll tell you in a little bit, and then, for whatever reason, the work projects didn't work out, or they needed the men someplace else, or over the years, the number of enrollees, dropped. So they didn't have enough people to fill all the camps, so they would close a camp and move those folks to another camp. So it was a little like, it's a little hard to keep track of where everybody was. In May of 1934, 16 enrollees left Chicopee Falls for Breakabeen, and another 48 came later to establish the new camp on May 19th. Camp S93 was located on Baux Falls Road in the town of Fulton, half a mile from Route 30. This is Phil Scofo's salvage yard now. I presume he is still there. Do you know?
Yeah, he is.
Okay. The camp was set up on 15 acres, and Phil told me that documents he has seen indicate the government leased this site from farmer Percy Partridge for $1 a year. Camp administrators, led by Captain David Kirk, occupied an old house on the property, which had once been the David Hiltz farm. The enrollees lived in tents for the first few months until 5 barracks buildings were completed in September 1934. There were also a rec hall, mess hall, an infirmary, garage, shop, and other buildings. Earl Brockway of the Conservation Department was project superintendent. The average number of men working in the field every day there was 120, and they planted an average of 60,000 trees a day. These were red pine, black locust, Scotch pine, Norway spruce, as we see here, white spruce, Japanese larch, and white ash, most of the seedlings coming from the Saratoga nurseries. 14 Breakabeen CCC men under foreman Pop van de Brogart planted 18,300 red pine seedlings in one day in the fall of 1935. That's 50 trees every 60 seconds. The seedlings were planted in Summit, Schoharie County, according to the camp's own newspaper, The Advance. I had a lot of respect for the boys, said Supervisor Earl Brockway in a 1996 interview for Ulster magazine. It was a lot of hard manual labor, a lot of blisters on their hands. If a guy gold bricked, laid down on the job, the other boys got on him. When the temperature was 0, we took them. When it was below, we didn't. It was surprising what they would take. Looks like they about reached the limit in this in this picture. So-called gooseberry gangs would roam the woods and fields, tearing out gooseberry bushes because they are carriers of white pine blister rust, a threat to the white pines they were planting. Also built 10 miles of truck trails for access and firefighting purposes, built firefighting ponds and thinned existing woodlots. Fires were a constant threat. In the same issue of the Advance was an article about the CCCers responding to 3 brush fires in 3 days, one near Grand Gorge, another near Fultonham, the third in Coal Hollow. 42 men managed to jam into the truck, perhaps to their sorrow, as a long hike up the mountain and hard work on a steep ravine in pitch darkness awaited them. Camp 93 built the 68-foot tall mounted Seantha Fire Tower in Stamford in 1934. Fire observer Alton Henderson reported 13 fires from the tower the following year, 1935. So I will just say that all these millions of trees that the CCC guys were planting were vulnerable to all kinds of stuff, pests and fire and drought. So now that the state and the federal government had so much invested in planting all these plantations, and you can see them, they're pretty square, and usually monoculture, plantations of trees, they had to protect them. So they put the CCC guys to work building the fire towers so they could watch for fires, and lining with stone existing spring sites in the woods and creating fire ponds so that the first responders could fill up their tanks, their Indian tanks, with water and fight fires out where the trucks couldn't reach. And they, as in Boyceville, which was called a bug camp, they sent the guys into the woods and had them look for clusters of gypsy moths. And as you saw, the white pine, the gooseberry bushes were ripped out because of the blister rust. So it was kind of the state was encouraging individuals to plant trees at this time, right from the 19-teens on, really, and before the teens, trying to get people to plant trees, and municipalities. There were a lot of municipal forests that were planted in this era, and school forests, because the state was saying that you plant your trees now, and 30 years from now you can harvest them, make money to pay the school budget, to pay for your retirement, So there was a whole forestry mindset at this time. And so the CCC was established just in time to continue to plant millions of trees, which the state had been planting in the teens and the 20s on those abandoned farms, as they did in Schoharie County and other places. Some of the plantations that you see were actually predated the CCC, and some even came after the CCC as the state continued to plant trees. Trees are trees. I mean, back then in the 20s, there were a lot of abandoned farms. There was a lot of, homesteads had been cleared right up to the tops of the hills, as you know. You've seen those photographs, so there was a lot of land to replant, to reforest. So Camp 93 in Breakabine also built the concrete dam across the Schoharie Creek in Prattsville that keeps coarse fish from ascending into trout waters. A temporary tent camp was established while the Prattsville project was constructed. Dr. Duncan Best of Middleburg. Has anybody been to the Best House? Speaking of wonderful historic sites, yeah. Well, this was him. Dr. Duncan Best of Middleburg was the camp physician. He would drive the 5 miles to camp each morning, prescribe medications for anyone that needed them in the 7-bed infirmary, and leave it to 2 enrollee assistants to handle things till he returned. There was a basketball team, a debate team, an arts and crafts area, and a library. These were, there were movies and dances and music supplied by those who played instruments, brought them with them. This guy's got a cool dobro here. Skiing contests and boxing matches were held, and classes offered in a variety of vocational areas to prepare for their return to the world. Most of the enrollees came from the Capital District in this particular camp, but some came from New York City. Michael Dutch Irving was one of them. His mother was an Irish immigrant, his dad a fireman. They and their 8 kids lived in a cold water flat in Harlem, and Mike worked in a grocery store before signing up for the CCC. He was a middleweight boxer of some renown in the CCC camp circuit. Well, Dutch and his wife-to-be, Helen Effner, met at a block dance on Main Street in Middleburg. He used to drive the truck that carried CCC guys from Break-A-Bean to outings in surrounding communities like the Partridge Nest, run by Percy Partridge, with its snack bar and ball field near a swimming hole in Schoharie Creek. I had been looking for a picture of the Partridge Nest for years. If anybody knows where I might find one, let me know. It sounds like it was quite the happening place. The Fulton town history quotes Hilda Partridge Gale as saying there was dancing to the Victrola on the porch, and the CCC guys were there every night because it was just down the street. The CCCers also went to dances at Bessie Cleveland's Valley View Farm and Guest House.
That's right.
Well, the camp was closed in 1941 as the CCC wound down and the nation readied for war. Many CCCers entered the service and found that their training in manual labor and living together in barracks under Army supervision was good preparation for the military. Surprise. Once the camp closed, the land went back to Percy Partridge. The site and the buildings were eventually purchased by Madison Hitz, whose father had owned the land before Partridge. Before the Partridges, I should say. In 1947, Madison and Bertha Scofo Hiltz converted the property to Madison Garden Village, a resort where people could stay overnight or rent an apartment for the summer. It included the White Crow Motel, which had been one of the CCC barracks buildings. The rec hall was used for dancing and socializing, and the mess hall became the dining hall, and later a bar. They continued to use water from an artesian well that supplied a 30-foot water tower that had been built by the CCC. Well, Phil purchased the property from his aunt and uncle in the early 1970s, ran the bar, and rented apartments to hunters and others. Over the years, the mess hall burned, the rec hall was dismantled, the education building and a couple of barracks fell under the weight of snow. But several CCC buildings remain, and they are used as living quarters. So you can still get a sense of what the camp looked like. So let me tell you something about the other 2 Schoharie camps. Saving the soil was the focus of SCS 5 in Gallupville, one of only 11 CCC camps in the state whose work was directed by experts from the Federal Soil Conservation Service, an agency of the U.S. Department of Agriculture. On April 27, 1935, just a few months before the Gallupville camp was established, Congress passed Public Law 7446 in response to the Dust Bowl in the Midwest. The law recognized that, quote, the wastage of soil and moisture resources on farm, grazing, and forest lands is a menace to the national welfare. And it directed the Secretary of Agriculture to establish the Soil Conservation Service as a permanent agency in the USDA. In 1994, Congress changed SCS's name to the Natural Resources Conservation Service. It shows the topsoil being blown away in the Midwest. Yeah, so let me see if the next slide is one. I don't want to end the show. Okay. Company 1286 arrived at the camp just outside the hamlet of Gallopville above Fox Creek in October of 1935, many of them having been transferred from service in Clarkia, Idaho. They soon set to work on farms whose owners had signed agreements with the SCS to allow projects on their overworked fields. Over the next 5 years, the CCC dug diversion ditches, built check dams, planted windbreaks, and improved woodlands. They fenced off woodlots from grazing animals and laid out fields for strip cropping and rotation planting. Said the Knickerbocker News in December 1935, quote, in an earlier generation, the SCS might have found it difficult to coax farmers into letting it step in and correct such evils. The SCS would have been accused of interfering with the hand of God. Farmers of today, through recent setbacks, have been persuaded that God indeed helps those who help themselves. Company 1286 also built a kiln on Middle Road near the camp where there was an outcropping of manlius limestone. There they quarried more than 500 tons of stone from these horizontal layers, burned it in this oven, and then pulverized it to produce lime to be spread on farm fields. I used to draw lime from there for our fields, recalled Robert Loden in 1999. The Old Stone Fort Museum staff found these photos of the kiln in the collection of the late Chet Zimmer. Chris Kiefer is also anxious to know more about this site. Does anybody know Chris? She might be a good speaker sometime because she has done considerable research on 19th century beehive lime kilns built and used by individual farmers in Carlisle, Sharon, Cherry Valley, and Duanesburg areas. And she has located 16 of them here in Schoharie County. Excuse me. Robert Loden's brother Al was a sergeant at the Gallopville CCC camp. The company took out stone walls to make fields larger. Bob recounted that the men worked in our woodland, taking out brush and decaying trees. They did a good job building ponds and dikes along Fox Creek. Could I get a glass of water, please?
Sure.
Sorry. Stone's throw from Gallopville to Albany County, so the CCC also planted 90,000 trees around the Altamont Reservoir to prevent erosion and to provide natural filtration to protect water quality, something that's being done continually still here in the New York City watershed. Thank you. They planted another 12,000 pines and spruce on the lower part of Mount Schenck behind Cobleskill High School. The school had only recently been completed, and the hillside was bare until the CCC planted the conifers in a neatly rowed plantation. They also likely planted some of the trees in the shape of a large letter C. Ted Short says this was a local landmark for decades. Does anybody remember seeing a C in trees behind the Cobleskill High School? No? We're still looking for a picture of that too, if anybody spies one. This site is now behind the Ryder School before the trees grew and the C filled in. We're looking, as I said, for a photo, and you can contact me or Ted Short if you find something like that. It looks like it could be it. So here's a photo of that camp in the midst of a deep and obviously very cold winter. There are accounts of CCC companies being called out to help remove snow after blizzards and clean up after floods and windstorms. But I wonder what they did the rest of the time when they couldn't get into the woods and the fields. I can't imagine what kind of work they would have them do under these conditions. Boys of Company 1286 were credited with stopping a house fire in Gallupville in February 1936, and with saving horses from a burning barn on another occasion. As a result, a number of the CCC boys became guests in local homes and entered into the life of the townspeople, recalled former company member Robert Egan. As in many communities that hosted CCC camps, the young men stationed there and the young women who lived nearby often found each other. Gladys Wise of Gallupville and her best friend Wilma Willie Becker, also of Gallupville, would go to dances of the CCC, and that's where they met their future husbands. Gladys met Renee Francis Frank Matt. They were married in Gallupville in 1939 and moved to New York City, where Frank became a union electrician. They later returned to build a home in the village of Schoharie. Wilma Willie Becker met Eugene Gino Turchi, where they were married in Gallupville in 1939. Gino owned and operated service stations in the Scotia-Glenville area, and in 1963, built the Northway Heights Golf Club in Clifton Park, known today as Eagle Creek. The couples remained lifelong friends, so I just wanted to do a shout out to Robert Holt for this, his reminiscences and for the photos. These little personal side stories are really charming. Camp SCS-5 operated through at least 1940. Some of its buildings still stand, occupied as housing units. These stone pillars at the intersection of Adams and Pickett Hill Road are believed to be remnants of the original camp entrance. Well, some of the buildings of Camp S-119 in Livingstonville were also repurposed as housing. Established in August 1935, this camp housed companies 2203, 397, and 2234, which were made up of mostly World War I veterans. A junior company occupied the camp in 1936. Let me tell you a little bit about the veteran connection here. Veterans of any previous war or conflict were allowed to join the CCC following two mass demonstrations in Washington, D.C. in 1932 and 33. These marches and encampments by the Bonus Expeditionary Force, they called themselves, drew thousands of down-and-out World War I veterans and their families, seeking immediate payout of adjusted compensation certificates, or bonuses, which had been approved by Congress in 1924 for these veterans, but were not scheduled for full payment until 1945. In an effort to force early lump sum payment of these urgently needed benefits, the Bonus Army converged on the nation's capital in the spring of 1932. They were ejected very roughly by the military, led by our hero, General Douglas MacArthur. One of the veterans was killed, and they set fire to the tents and the encampments and scattered these families. It was a very shameful episode in American history that we don't hear too much about. They didn't get their bonus that year, and actually they didn't get their bonus until 1936. But in the meantime, the following year, FDR took office, established the CCC, and as a kind of a afterthought, or because the Bonus Expeditionary Force showed up in Washington again that spring and summer, they had the brilliant idea of, well, you know, we really can't give you the money, but we can give you jobs in the CCC that'll pay you $30 a month. And they took it. A lot of them took it. 2,500 veterans took up that offer. So it diffused that situation. Camp S-119 functioned like the other CCC camps in that men were housed in 40-person barracks like those at Breakamine. They were responsible for keeping vehicles and equipment running. This was good training too for later, as you know. And they worked year-round, which might have been a death-defying activity during hunting season. Phil Scofield found this in the, his what used to be the camp there. And no, they would still put these guys in the woods during hunting season, and they put signs up saying, just be careful, don't shoot them. They called into action in emergencies like this lost child incident in 1936. And of course, they planted many trees. Chester Armolino, whose father was stationed at this camp when it housed a junior company, said, as a young boy, my father took me to see the pine forest that he worked on the Hoverville Road going to Rensselaerville. While information and images of their work projects are scarce, we do know that a contingent of men from Company S-119 occupied a temporary tent camp between Tannersville and Hunter in Greene County in 1936 to help Tannersville Company S-97 build a road through North Lake State Campground. The veterans built 3 miles of camp roadway while their junior counterparts constructed campsites, fireplaces, and other amenities, and raised the level of the lake dam by 2 feet. An amphitheater was constructed for campground programming. This is not a very good picture, but this is what I'm told, the amphitheater as it appeared in the late 30s. It was located where the large parking lot at North South Lake is today. In the Catskills, North Lake, Devil's Tombstone, Woodland Valley, and Beaver Kill State Campgrounds are the results of CCC labor. Well, the CCCers I have talked with and read about have fond memories of their days in the Corps. Many called it the best time of their lives when they grew up, grew strong, and learned valuable skills. And they felt real pride in a hard-won paycheck and in the genuine contributions that they were making to their country. Many CCC alumni went on to serve the nation in World War II and to successful careers in business, government, the arts. Few ever became millionaires, of course, but what they learned about discipline and perseverance and self-confidence and tolerance was worth its weight in gold. And what they left for the rest of us to enjoy well into the future is simply priceless. So these are some of the accomplishments of the 161 CCC camps in New York State between 1933 and 1942. 220,000 enrollees and supervisory personnel were employed, receiving a paycheck and supporting families. $41 million provided to those dependents. 221.5 million trees, 19 fire towers, 633 miles of foot trails, 234 miles of stream improvement, 30 state parks developed, 1,448 acres of campsites established in the Catskills and the Adirondacks. The Conservation Department's Forestry Division was in charge of the CCC activity in the Catskill Park and the Adirondack Park. The camps that were the remaining camps, and there were many, obviously there were another 150 throughout the rest of the state, including up the Hudson Valley and in other non-forest preserve areas, were directed by the National Park Service. Those camps and those companies helped with the development of many state parks, from Letchworth way out in the western part of the state to Taconic State Park in the Hudson Valley. So whenever you go to a state park or a state campground, the chances are you should be thanking some young men in the Civilian Conservation Corps. I want to thank you all for being here and being so patient, and these fine people for supplying me with information and photographs. Some of them I think are probably gone by now, but thank you. And here are some links if you're looking for more information about the CCC. When I started writing this book, the book came out in 2008, and when I started writing the book, there was an organization for CCC alumni. And it was called, I think it was called CCC Alumni Association or something, and they put out a newsletter. Fewer and fewer and fewer of these men are alive now. There's very few now. And so it has become the CCC Legacy organization, Legacy, Civilian Conservation Corps Legacy. And so they have a website. They are developing the CCC Museum in Virginia. And they do put out a newsletter, so you can check it out if you wish. Thank you very much. Anybody have any questions?
I do. I live in Manorville, and right off South Mountain Road is a CCC road that goes up and over to Wyndham.
Okay.
How come that's not mentioned whatsoever?
I don't know. How come I didn't mention it?
No, I don't know. Why isn't it mentioned anywhere?
That's some of the pictures I sent, like the Mount Pisgah area. They're not, it's state conservation, but it might have only, we don't know what the tie to CCC was.
Yeah, I don't know. I honestly don't know about that. The fact that there's a road named CCC Road, there's another CCC Road in Tannersville, I think, that happened, especially if it was a road that went into the forest, a newly planted plantation, But I don't know the situation here, I don't know.
Cause it's all like surrounding state land, so
Yeah.
to speak.
Yeah.
And probably Theodore did that, but I'm thinking,
Wait, let me,
why, like, they just cut down, conservation just cut down one half of a mountain right around the corner. Because I think the civilian corps planted all those pines going all the way up, and they're 90 years old.
Mhm.
And they cut them because they're gonna die. So they cut them, and they took them to Canada to be,
that's interesting, because
make 2x4s out of them and sell them back to the US.
well, yeah, I mean, that's sort of what the intent was in planting these forests, was for them to be money
Right,
makers
and
down
they
the road.
decided to, in Stanford, they decided to take them down before they rot and
Yeah.
have usage of, and then replanted quite a few pines and stuff, but I don't know it's gonna be ever like that again.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know whether it was the State Conservation Department. Earlier, I talked about the forestry efforts of the state, and then which kind of led right into the CCC era with more planting. But let me read this to you, and this is a clipping that Kim sent to me that I had not seen before. And I don't have a date on it, but it came from a scrapbook in which everything else around it was from the 30s. So, I mean, it does not mention the CCC, but I'll read it to you. Employed 91 men for 2 weeks at Manorkill. From the Manorkill correspondent. This might have been the Catskill paper.
It was probably the Catskill Reporter.
Okay. The reforestation work in this vicinity has been completed. It was under the supervision of Lloyd Austin, assisted by state officials who occasionally inspected the work. About 2 weeks were required to finish the job, and the territory covered and reforested included property formerly owned by Rivenberg and Skemmerhorn of this place and Brando of Oak Hill, and covered a tract of 600 acres. 91 men were employed, but at various jobs. 2 tree planters together were supposed to plant 2,000 trees daily, or at the rate of 1,000 each. About 1 million trees were set out, and there are prospects of a fine state forest in this locality in the future.
That's right. That's
So I don't know specifically where this was located, and it doesn't mention the CCC. It says under the supervision of Lloyd Austin. Did I mention him?
No, he's a local guy who was involved in a lot of conservation efforts.
Yeah,
It sounds like a state project, but I don't know if it was a CCC project.
Yeah, and I will also say that I forgot to mention this, that the CCC was only allowed to work on state lands that were owned by the state. They, however, some got around that. There was a ski center established down in Phoenicia, and the owners of this proposed ski center deeded 6 acres or something to the state so that they would qualify to have the Margaretville and the Boyceville CCC camps clear trails, ski trails, and build a ski center there, which was privately owned, privately operated. So, and the other caveat to that is that they were allowed to go on private property if there were, for instance, gooseberry bushes that needed to be yanked out because it was threatening the trees that were just planted on state land. So there were a lot of irate private property owners who lost vegetation and I guess didn't really have much to say about it. But those are the exceptions that I can recall. This sounds like state land. That state was.
It is.
But it wasn't necessarily CCC. So that's
CCC went right up through the state land.
right. They might have employed some CC workers at some point, but the project itself might not have been under the supervision of the CC.
I don't know. I'd have to.
I just wonder why it's never mentioned.
I don't know.
So-
Because I don't know about it, so I guess.
Now they changed it to another name, Bluebird.
Yeah, but if you, so I can help out a little bit with this. So these are photographs from that, and Diane looked at the photographs, and they don't really match what was happening in some of the other CC camps, like the uniforms and things like that. But this does identify that it was done by the State Conservation Department.
State Reforestation Area Number 2. And the caption, this is from the State Archives, does not say anything about, it just says Conesville, Schoharie County, and the Catskill Mountains. The date is unrecorded, likely 1920s or 30s.
Yeah.
So the one picture that I showed of men planting, I got from this collection.
Right, that one right there.
So, just be able to show what the process was. That's the picture that I used. But I don't know,
I don't know
whether
why
it's
it's not
CCC.
mentioned. You got state land, they planted the trees, now they harvest them. I'm like, I don't know, I just wonder.
Anybody else have any other questions?
Diane, just curious about how they chose the locations, for the
camps?
That,
Yeah.
They're in some areas, that's good. You want what the connections were.
It was kind of a political process.
I wondered.
Sure. Yeah, if you had outspoken community leaders, business people who could see that, these guys are going to be getting $5 a month to go spend downtown. There's 200 of them. You can do the math. That seemed like they could go get a lot of nickel beers for that. So it took local leaders lobbying their legislators to put in a good word. I'm not exactly sure what the machinations were behind the scenes as to which communities got them.
No, I was just wondering if you
But-
had any
but,
sense of that.
Yeah, but I do know that, for instance, Clark Sanford, who was a real community booster in Margaretville, was very vocal about getting a camp there. A lot of the people who lived in these towns were not so sure about that. 200 young men in proximity to their daughters was they weren't really excited about it. But those people who had businesses were very excited about it. And as I mentioned, for the most part, the relationships were cordial between the camps and the community.
Diane, the only way I can see somebody planting 1,000 trees in a day, 8 hours, would be if they just spiked it, made a spike hole, plugged fertilized soil, a seed, fertilized,
Seedling.
and moved. Oh, they
That's exactly
actually
what they
did do
That's
seeds.
exactly what they did. They had 2 guys. There would be partners. I forgot to show you a tool of the trade. This is an actual CCC mattock. Maybe it's not a mattock. Does anybody know what this is? Somebody corrected me once when I said it was a mattock.
Well, Maddox has 2 blades,
Two-
one this way and one this, but that is.
So this is not a mattock. I don't know what this
Right.
is. I should know what this is because I'm holding it in my hand.
Is that a dibble?
A dibble?
Yeah.
I think
I
one of those
Could
is,
have been, because I know I have a friend who helps replanting trees, and he calls the device, it's a straight thing up and down, he calls it a dibble.
Oh,
Yeah, there's
I don't know,
cone
I don't
shape,
think that's
like-
what this is, but it has CCC on the end. So what, the way
It's a
that,
tree
so,
planting tool.
Hmm?
It's a tree
a
planting.
tree
tool.
planting tool.
There you go.
Heavy one, very heavy one. They would, so one guy would have a canvas sack around his middle full of seedlings that came from the Saratoga nurseries, and they were probably this long. And the guy ahead of him would, dig a hole, use a mattock, pull up the sod, and then walk, and then do another, and then, keep doing this. Maybe using this tool, although this is not a mattock, and I've heard you used a mattock, whatever that was. I know you're showing me that right.
Yeah,
but
no, it does say dibble to make holes for,
It says this, is that what this
No.
looks like?
but it
There's
doesn't
no
have a
picture.
picture.
Okay. So shows you what I know about planting trees. So anyway, so then the guy behind with the seedling would put the seedling in the hole, step on it, and the next, and the next, and the next, and many dozens of groups of men doing this, marching along in a line, could plant thousands of trees and millions as they did across the country.
And the pattern would be like a yard apart
Yeah,
and not in rows or anything
Yes, in
like that.
rows.
Oh,
in rows. That's why you see, if you go to any of these plantations, you can, sometimes they wobble a little bit, but they're very uniform. And often they were planted too close together. So all these years later, you have them crowding each other out, and they fall over in a windstorm and they knock each other down, and that's what happens.
Exactly what happened.
Yeah.
Where I'm talking.
Right.
All in rows.
Yes,
yeah.
So presently, if somebody doesn't pay their taxes, it goes to Schoharie County or whatever county. And how did the state acquire all what we know as the state land? I'm assuming it was repossessed farmland.
they bought it real cheap. Some of it was repossessed farmland. These were, people who had just moved on. They just, they'd worn out the land, or they went to town to get a better job, and they were willing to get rid of part with their property to the state for next to nothing, pennies on the dollar, really, what it was worth. So that's, I don't know, whether there were negotiations that went on, or whether the state just came and said, hey, we'll give you, $600 for your 650 acres.
Paying the private landowners and bought it that way, rather than getting it through the county maybe.
Yeah, I don't know how the county, I guess the county would obtain property when they didn't pay the taxes. But the state acquired property. Do you know any more about this, John? About how they acquired property for the state forest preserve, and because all of the state forest preserve, though, that was all privately owned land, at one time, and unforested for the most part.
There's old foundations throughout those state
Yeah,
lands.
exactly.
Well,
Yeah,
that article said that was, they were working on state land that had been purchased.
that had
by
been
private
somebody's,
people.
yeah, absolutely, yeah.
They're calling it an appeal.